A very warm welcome to another day in our talk series, Mohiniyattam on a wider canvas. We have with us a very distinguished speaker today, Dr. Uttara Asha Coorlawala, who is the adjunct professor of dance at Barnard College. Dr. Coorlawala is interested in bridges between theory and practice and on recirculations of movement through time and cultures. Her writings about the qualities of Indianness in dance have served as criteria at the international performance level. She has advocated for development opportunities for artists and performance opportunities for cross-cultural and interdisciplinary performers. She has also served as the curator for the Erasing Borders Festival of Indian Dances, held in New York since 2009. Within the field of dance studies, she has served on the editorial board of the Dance Research Journal, and she has been the advisor to the Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi. She has also been the dance director at the National Center for Performing Arts in Mumbai. Dr. Coorlawala is also a recipient of the Sangeet Natak Academy Puraskar, which is the highest award in performing arts, and it was the first time that the award was given to an American. As a dancer and choreographer, Coorlawala has initiated in India what has since become a movement towards intercultural innovations. Her choreography includes elements from modern dance, Bharatanatyam and yoga, and she has done several solo tours across India, Europe, Japan and the United States. She is also listed as an empowerment artist with the ICCR and the New York Foundations for the Arts. Her teaching credits include the Princeton University, the Alvin Ailey School, Long Island University, the Spence School, the University of Miami, and more recently at the University of Santa Cruz, the University of Hawaii, the University of North Texas. She's also been an invited speaker at the Natyakala conferences held in Chennai. And not to mention, she has several publications to her credit. We are indeed honored to have an accomplished scholar and a performer with such a depth of experience as Dr. Coorlawala with us on this platform. I have always been in awe of her writings and her scholarships and I was especially fortunate to have Dr. Coorlawala as one of the examiners for my doctoral dissertation. Several of her papers have been cited a lot by students of Indian dance, and especially the paper called The Sanskritized Body. A very warm welcome to Dr. Coorlawala, who will be addressing us on the topic of recent trends in Indian dance scholarship.
Good morning. Hello. Thank you, Dr. Maithilinu, for inviting me to speak on recent trends in scholarship in Indian dance for the Mohiniyattam dialogues. When I think of research in Indian dance, I think not only of the writers and the books that they have written, but also of the dancers who have delved their dance heritages with creative passion. This too I consider a kind of research, so I will be including that in my discussion of dance as text. In the next 15 minutes, I will briefly explore writings of the revivalists, reconstruction and post-colonials, in global flows of interconnected ideas. While I have tried to proceed chronologically, I've had to allow that certain ideas continue over several years and they transform as they evolve. So in these cases, I follow an idea to the current time and then I return to the chronological marker from where I digressed. So, the first time that I began to find books in English on indigenous dances of India itself was in the 60s and 70s, and these were like upscale guidebooks or art historically, lavishly illustrated books with many photographs featuring dancers and brief descriptions about the tradition. There are also authoritative books written by dancers on the forms that they studied and that they presented. For example, Mrinalini Sarabhai, Leela Samson, Meenakshi Bhavnani, and earlier to all of them, Ragini Devi. India's earliest dance scholars and critics were self-made. They were guided by their enthusiasm for dance and their excitement in discovering new forms, the rage of the time. Mohan Kokar and Dr. Sunil Kothari were amongst those who now emerged from a famous All-India seminar of dance in 1958, organized by the Sangeet Natak Academy. It was at this conference where the dance form now known as Odissi was first seen on the national urban stage as an art form with its own aesthetic characteristics and regional history. However, it was not till 1960 that Odissi was acknowledged as a classical art form by the Sangeet Natak Academy. It was also the conference where Rukmini Devi authoritatively declared that Kuchipudi was to be classified along with Bhagavad Nataka Mela under the category of Bharatanatyam. Her statement was accepted at the time, but today Kuchipudi is promoted as the dance style representative of the culture of Andhra Pradesh, where it has its own form, its own linguistics, aesthetics, and content. For our predecessors working in the shadows of colonialism, it was extremely important to excavate the past, because for them scholarship practices, as rules, assumptions, all were mediated by our location inside the English language. But when anyone sees bodies performing in local and regional languages outside of English for the very first time, this was very exciting, liberating. These persons could sense that something physical, something that you could actually see, hear, feel, actually existed outside the English language and its associated cultural values. Further, these indigenous bodies moved in radically different ways from their Western counterparts, and they were still beautiful. With this astounding experience of connection and at-one-ment, sometimes an audience would feel that they were witnessing some kind of deep, pre-modern past, a kind of time and culture warp. No wonder then that the early group of scholars of Indian dance would want to delve history for all that it could offer. Our best example is the work of Kapila Vatsyayan, for example, who excavated references to dance in texts going back to the undisputedly oldest of texts, the Rig Veda, where she excavated the story of this goddess of dawn, Ushas, the dancer. She combed through centuries to cite poems, shastras, dramas, and of course she describes in detail the circle dance of Krishna in Srimad Bhagavatam with all its theological underpinnings. So dance was being brought out of the shadows of folklore and religiosity and into the world of high art. And then, of course, she summarized the categories of movement as described in the Natya Shastra, but she presented them as having the elements constitutive of the notion of technique. She didn't go so far as to discuss them as technique, but she discussed them as how they connected with each other, which is also constitutive of technique. She turned to stone sculpture as a more stable testimony of how dance was given great importance by rulers whose temples and palaces were adorned with friezes carved from stone, depicting musicians and various poses of dance. Scholarship was exploring and recovering images of dance from the traces of evidence left by history. These scholars felt that this kind of research needed to be done to establish a base for the idea of a pan-Indian sense of aesthetic Indianness. During the 70s, a young dancer, Padma Subramaniam, was exploring shastras and dance and comparing them with the sculptures of Kumbakonam, Brideshwar, Chidambaram temples, However, her work was different from other researchers in that her archaeological exploration was not just rigorous archaeologically, but it was also a creative performative exploration in embodying the dance, in embodying history. Brother Subramanian proposed, for example, that when many figures are shown on temple walls to have many arms in many positions, that these various figures were not gods and goddesses because of their placement in the temple outer walls and because of their costumes. The multiple arm positions were probably meant, she proposed, that they should describe the movement of the arms. I think that in histories of dance, this was probably the first step to this idea of understanding how canons of grammar and aesthetic rules could be actually performed. And Subramanian's research moved a step towards discussing embodiment, which is what scholars are delving today. The scholarly linking of living bodies to aesthetic theories also set the scene for what I consider a kind of a race to recover a pre-modern past for the dancers of the present. It was not until the 90s that Susan Lee Foster changed critical writing on dance by applying to dance Derrida's notion of how meaning is transformed by its immediate context. Similarly, traces are written on the body by movements of the mover and by movers in the immediate environment, so the mover and the dance style impact each other. Choreography can then be seen as a form of bodily writing, and what was then left to brilliant scholars such as Janet O'Shea was to connect Foster's notion of embodying movement with Vatsayan's writing on the Natya Shastra to elucidate how the notion of technique was always already in the Natya Shastra. Similarly, Alessandra Lopez Arroyo connected Foster's notion of dance as text and body as active subject-driven writing in the 2004, and with particular attention to Padma Subramanian's work in the 70s. So then today now in semiotic studies, we have Maithili Anoop's writings. Excuse me, I have a sore throat. Reconstruction. Time. Gradually it developed that the enthusiasm of early excavationists encouraged performers and presenters to focus on essentials. The classical dance was being mystified. It was being placed on a pedestal to be admired as unchanging, as eternal, as transcendent. To the extent that, when in 1992, Sona Ransin declared that she was going to perform a retrospective of her works after 20 or 30 years of dancing, critics asked, how could there be such a thing as a retrospective when Bharatanatyam and Odissi are eternal? Simultaneously, Indian dance critics dissuaded non-Indian dancers from writing about Indian dance, saying they had no comprehension of the cultural depths involved. For example, it was said that the structure and content of forms like Bharatanatyam had been described in the Natya Shastra itself, hence its undisputed classical status. Meanwhile, the process of explaining, categorizing, upgrading, that was labeled Sanskritization, had already been started in the late 30s and continued after Rukmini Devi's first performance. It was a process of positioning the dance as having not just artistic but also social value. Gradually, dancers, gurus, critics all became more and more focused on how ancient the roots of the remaining forms were, and that all the dance forms in India would find it beneficial to trace their lineages to the Natya Shastra. Starting out with a list of 4 forms, India has arrived as a proud fool of a list of 4 more classical forms, while dance styles like Chow still aspire to its official recognition. The past somehow became controllable, a flexible storehouse and resource for all Indian dance forms. Such forms, it was argued, had deep roots, were profound, and had a transformative effect on the viewer. The argument went that if the viewer was unmoved or uncomprehending, then that was due to some lack in the viewer's unsympathetic, insensitive nature. as if it might have had nothing to do with the dancer, her persona, or her abilities and skills. So the revivalists unconsciously fell into the same trap of mystifying dance as the Orientalists. This argument held hands, as it were, with the view that India's glory lay in her past, and its manifestations in the present were, by implication, just pathetic. That strategy for exalting dance could only lead to rigor mortis. It did. By the mid-90s, ticketed contemporary performances were being sold out, while the attendance at free classical dance concerts was sparse. During the 70s and the 90s, Sunil Kothari wrote several books on Indian classical dance and contemporary dances. He focused his writing on extensive research on the dancers, their gurus, their aesthetic genealogies, with capsule histories. Unlike many of his predecessors, he based his writing and research on live performances, the real people, as they unfolded, and was an active witness and participant in the classicization of the dance forms, including Satriya. Starting out with a list of 4 dance forms, India became the proud home of 4 more classical forms, while dance forms like Chau still aspire to that official recognition. Because with it, so many benefits come, so it's worth it for form to be stamped, as it were, branded as classical. So with so much significance and financial advantage to those who are counted among the classical forms, today's scholars are asking, what are the meanings, what are the values assigned to the classical? For whom is it important and why? So dance scholarship started following canonical models of art history for readers in India, but with increasing international interest in indigenous traditional forms, Indian dance became the material of anthropologists. In academia, one began to wonder why Indian dance was always positioned as other and as opposed to ballet. So another marker in Indian dance studies was Joanne K. Moku's seminal 1969 article, An Anthropologist Looks at Ballet as a Form of Ethnic Dance. You probably have known this article. It was extensively discussed, and it opened a path for Indian dance scholars in the West to express their opinions more confidently. At the same time, in the 70s and 80s, the Indian dancers were thinking and asking the motives of their predecessors, piercing questions about reconstruction, representation, gender, alterity, difference. These included Chandralekha, Kumudini Lakhya, I count myself there, Ranjavati Sarkar, Ananya Chatterjee. All of them were asking questions. So after the social anthropologist Hobsbawm had declared that what was ancient was actually reinvented, that tradition was something that was reinvented and relatively new, that which had been deemed static and authentic was suddenly deemed modern and ever-transforming, like a flowing river. Dancers were questioning received narratives, and dance research was doing Shirshasana. It was going full reverse upon itself. This pushback against the mythologizing generalized national has recently been further reinforced by scholars such as Pallavi Chakravarti and Ramya Pacha. A trend to question not just the materials of dance, but the very thought structures by which they are studied, continues introducing into dance research post-colonial terms like third space, that's Homi Bhabha, asking questions about embodiment, about what was left out or assumed, what was in the spaces between the languages of the spoken and the non-verbal languages of the body. Whereas Kapila Vasayan spoke of the underlying unity of Indian dance and arts, later scholars started to write about the dispersion of techniques and content by itinerant performers all over the world, spread of it to America, Britain, Australia, Africa. So Jana Touche's book, Bharatnatyam, At Home in the World, addresses the idea of a global and a local Bharatanatyam in the diaspora. Most recently, scholars such as Kaustavi Sarkar and Anurima Chatterjee question gender assumptions through a space of comfort, confidence, and brilliance. Dance research now generally tends to focus on the immediate context of the dance, to debunk mythologies of origin, but to attend to how they signify and what the myths say about the dance, to determine how it was being positioned. Anurima Janaji has deeply researched and theorized Odissi dance as a form where all the dancers, gurus and audiences are deeply connected via their commitment to the dance. And at the recent 2018 Worldwide Conference of the Dance Studies Association, Contra Dance and Conflict, Indian dance scholars were at the helm, and Indian dance forms were not merely represented here, but had carved out a space of academic surety and wider interest than the particular. Many more scholars, whom I have not mentioned here, for no particular reason, are doing excellent research and writing about Indian dance globally. So Indian dance research itself speaks globally. Thank you. I hope you will ask me some questions now.
Okay. Thank you again, ma'am, for joining us today. It's really interesting how in your talk you were able to seamlessly connect and draw links between scholarship that has happened in different places, not just India but also in other universities on Indian dance, and also over a period of time, that is at least 4 decades I think you have looked at. So that was really interesting, that the way you could see the larger trends and patterns and give us a holistic perspective, a bird's eye view. So thank you for that. And I have a few questions.
I'll try.
What do you think are the promising areas of research now, especially now, since the stories of classical Indian dance have been told and retold many times? So what do you think are the areas where scholars can work on?
If I knew, I would be writing them. But yeah, but I do think that now a focus on what people are actually doing instead of the prescriptive aspect of classicism.
Yes.
So, and I think from what I can see from our dance festival, that dancers some are recovering the past items, some are doing research in poets who have never been written about before, or whose poetry has never been danced before. So that kind of research I think is very interesting, and it's very contemporary. They might relate it to Black Lives Matter.
Okay.
That's, somebody has done a piece on Shiva Tandava and says it relates to Black Lives Matter.
Oh, all right. That's interesting.
So now, I think that's very interesting. Yes. And I think looking at what people are doing now is very, very interesting, instead of just only looking through the classical eye.
Okay.
Do you know what I'm saying?
Yes.
That's a very restrictive eye. Just who is doing what now and why.
Okay.
That's one direction. Okay. And it's happening everywhere, as you yourself have pointed out. So there are many areas that can be explored, different local areas, and the commonalities with the global and the differences with the local situation.
Okay. Okay. So, okay. Another question is about, this, the fact that especially in India, in dance scholarship, very often the dancer and the scholar is the same person. So do you think there are any limitations because of that?
Tremendous limitations. There is always the argument that the scholar dancer cannot be objective about their own work. Okay. And there is also the impossibility of their being able to see their own work. But then the advantage is that their they understand the intention and they understand the process.
Okay.
So those things can come through strongly.
Mm-hmm.
Now, sometimes a scholar dancer may be so blind spotted, as you had mentioned somewhere else,
Yes.
as to not see that their intention
Mm-hmm.
overwhelms what they actually do.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So that's another problem.
Mm-hmm.
So for that, they have to listen very carefully to audience feedback. But then when you listen to audience feedback, you have to ask which audience, where, why.
Mm-hmm.
So even audience feedback is not in any way pure.
Yes.
It's always from a certain perspective. So then one has to learn how to balance the perspectives.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yes, so
so
that's
these
tough.
are some of the.
Yes, a very tough job. Yes. So,
It calls for a lot of introspection.
yes, all right. Also, ma'am, could you, I mean, how do you see classical dances as they exist today? Because in your talk you mentioned that we have to classical dancers really have to struggle to get audiences compared to contemporary. So, what is the future? Yes.
That was in the 90s.
Yes.
But now I think they're getting audiences and they've gotten off their pedestal
Mm.
and they're not anymore saying, this is Natya, and not dictating to the audience what you should see. And this is a beautiful Tilana. No, this is a Tilana, and
Yes.
if you think it's beautiful, I'm happy,
Okay. Okay.
So all that sort of stuff has stopped.
Okay.
I think, at least in the performances that I curate in America
All right.
and my friends curate here. And
Okay.
we're very careful that the dancers should not project themselves in a wrong way.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
And the dancers I'm seeing here are doing some things that are very contemporary. For example, Rama Vaidyanath, she does that peacock Alaripu,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
And she has two narratives going in parallel, the peacock narrative and the Alaripu narrative. And that is very postmodern.
Mm-hmm.
So any sort of postmodern dancer can say, aha, two narratives. That's very interesting. This is something I can relate to.
Okay.
So that's the way that I think that it's working.
All right.
And
Yes.
that's an example.
Okay.
Yeah. So as dancers investigate more and more ways of choreographing, more and more, I don't know what the word is, the container in which they choreograph. If they look at it very freshly,
Okay.
it has the capacity to expand.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's very interesting because one of the speakers we had earlier for Mohiniyattam, Mandakini Trivedi,
Yes,
she was telling us about how a lot of experimentation is accepted in some forms like Bharatnatyam, but when it comes to Mohiniyattam, it is termed as not Mohiniyattam. So that risk is there, especially the perspectives or the authority of the purists is so much. It's a big hurdle for many people to experiment, and that itself stands in the way of any kind of innovations.
I can see that because you need lots more Mohiniyattam dancers to be out there doing it.
Yes.
And then it'll be more accepted.
That's true. That's true.
Yeah. And lots more people teaching it, so then they'll see it differently and start to not want only to perpetuate what they know. Because there's also this terror that what I know is being lost.
Yes.
But one has to let that go and trust the future.
Yes. Ma'am, another thing I wanted to ask you was you've also mentioned this that this began probably sometimes in the 90s where the classical dancers were seen as traditions with an unbroken lineage that goes back to ancient times, and as if, as you said, it's as if they existed in a time warp. Um, but we find that continuing even now, at least in India, because a lot of the research that is, the kind of research that is promoted or that is seen as valuable is research that goes back to these ancient or medieval texts that discuss dance. So, and we don't really see other kinds of research which is focused on, which is more in the contemporary context being discussed. So, what do you have to say
Well, I
about
would
that?
say that people who are still looking at the past, for them the past is very important, and it's a way to establish who they are
Yes, yes.
and what the dance could be. But I think it's always important to remember that I wasn't there in medieval times to see Kathak or to see whatever was being danced. So therefore, I cannot say that this is definitively what this text says, that what is happening today is definitively that, you know. So this claim that this is the unchanged eternal past is just not tenable. And you're right. I've heard people open performances. We invite dignitaries to come in and open a performance, and they'll be the first to say this dance is 3,000 years old. And then I will sort of cover my face in shame because we have invited this person. Yeah, it happens. And I think there's a sort of a sense of I'm not good enough, therefore I have to find out what's good about my culture. That something is lacking. In some way I'm inferior. And when we shed that, then I think we can shed this feeling of the past was great. It really does imply that the present is not. We really have to look at the present. And I think the present is exciting. There's some very interesting work happening.
Thank you, ma'am. I think we'll conclude with our session on that note. So, thank you again for joining us.
It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure. Okay.